You walk into a room, and before anyone says a word, you already know you're the one who didn't get the memo. Everyone else is wearing the same silhouette, talking about the same show, quoting the same sound that's been looping on every feed for the past 2 weeks, and you genuinely don't know what they're referencing. Not because you weren't paying attention, you were. You just didn't care enough to keep up. And here's the strange part. You're not confused about why you feel different. You've always felt this way. What confuses you is the moment right after, the small flicker of doubt that creeps in when someone looks at you like you missed something obvious. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You believe, mostly, that it doesn't matter. But if it really didn't matter, why does that look still land somewhere in your chest? You've built an entire identity around not following the crowd. You pick your own music before it's discovered. You wear what feels like you, not what's trending on a feed you don't even check that often. You've made peace, supposedly, with being the one who's a little out of step. And yet, there are nights when you wonder if that peace is real, or if it's just a story you've gotten very good at telling yourself. Because something doesn't add up. If not following trends is just who you are, why does it sometimes feel like a decision you're constantly defending? Why do you feel the need to explain it at all? Here's the part nobody warns you about. Being someone who doesn't follow trends is, in a lot of ways, a genuine gift. You see things clearly because you're not wearing the same lens everyone else is wearing. You're not easily swept up in panic buying, manufactured urgency, or the slow erosion of taste that comes from copying whatever's loudest. People who think for themselves tend to make better long-term decisions because they're not optimizing for fitting in, they're optimizing for what actually works for them. But there's a cost to this gift, and it's one most people who have it don't see clearly because it doesn't show up as a flaw, it shows up as fatigue. Because here's the trap. The same independence that protects you from blindly following the crowd can quietly turn into something else, a reflex to resist anything popular simply because it's popular, not because you've actually evaluated it, not because you thought it through and decided it wasn't for you, but because some part of you has wired popular to mean less authentic, even when that's not always true. So you end up making decisions in reverse. Not what do I actually want, but what would the crowd want so I can do the opposite. And if that's true even a little, then the question becomes uncomfortable. Are you really independent, or are you just orbiting the crowd from a different angle, still defined by them, just in negative space? That's the paradox. The thing that was supposed to free you from other people's choices might still be quietly run by them. So where does this actually come from? Because it's rarely random, and it's almost never as simple as, I just have good taste. For some people, it traces back to temperament, something closer to biology than story. Certain nervous systems are simply less reward-sensitive to social approval, where most brains get a small dopamine hit from group belonging, conformity, and being seen as in. Some people's reward systems respond more to novelty, autonomy, and internal consistency instead. It's like two different operating systems running the same hardware. One is built to seek the herd, the other is built to seek a clear signal of its own. Neither are broken, they're just tuned differently. But for a lot of people, it's not biology, it's history. Picture a kid who tried, at some point, to fit in, wore what was popular, liked what was popular, said what was popular, and got hurt anyway.
Maybe they were mocked even while doing everything right. Maybe belonging never came no matter how hard they performed it. So the brain, which is relentlessly practical, drew a conclusion. Trying to belong is not safe, but standing apart is. If I can't win by fitting in, I can win by not needing to. It's a little like a plant that grew on the edge of a forest instead of the middle. Less competition for light, more independence, but also more exposure, more wind, more distance from the rest of the canopy. The position that protects you is the same position that isolates you. And once that pattern sets in childhood, it doesn't stay in childhood. It becomes a lens. The question that naturally follows is the one most people never ask themselves directly. If this is where the pattern came from, where is it actually showing up in your life right now? And is it still protecting you, or is it just running on autopilot? Once you start looking, the signs are everywhere, and they're not always where you'd expect. You notice it in how you talk about things you actually like. Instead of saying, "I love this," you find yourself saying, "I liked it before everyone else did." The enjoyment gets tangled up with the timeline. If something becomes popular, a small, almost involuntary part of you starts pulling away from it. Not because your taste changed, but because the crowd caught up, and being early was part of the appeal. You notice it in relationships. You're drawn to people who are also a little outside the mainstream, which is fine, except sometimes you find yourself testing people, watching to see if they're just following the crowd before you decide if they're worth trusting. And if they show even one mainstream interest, some quiet judgment kicks in before you can stop it. You notice it at work, in meetings, in group decisions. Someone suggests the obvious, popular approach, and your gut reaction isn't, "Let's evaluate this." It's, "There has to be a better way because that's what everyone would do." Sometimes you're right. Sometimes you've just spent extra hours reinventing something that worked fine the first time purely because it wasn't yours. And the consequence compounds quietly. You start making decisions based on what to avoid rather than what to move toward. You'd rather be wrong in an original way than right in an obvious one, which sounds almost noble until you notice the energy cost, how much mental effort goes into staying different, how exhausting it is to always be calculating distance from the center instead of just heading toward what you actually want. The next sign shows up as a kind of low-grade loneliness. Not dramatic, just persistent. You've built a life that protects you from the discomfort of blending in, but it also quietly protects you from the comfort of belonging. And belonging, even for independent people, is still a basic human need, not a weakness, just biology. So the loop repeats. Avoid the crowd to protect your sense of self, feel a little more isolated, interpret that isolation as proof you're different, lean further into being different. Each round feels like confirmation. It's actually just momentum. Here's the part that's harder to see, because it's not happening on the surface. It's happening underneath, in the actual mechanism running the loop. The hidden mechanism is this. Somewhere along the way, your nervous system started treating blending in as a threat signal. Not consciously, you're not walking around thinking conformity equals danger, but on a deeper, faster level, the level that decides things before your conscious mind catches up, sameness has become associated with the old wound, the mockery, the rejection, the failed attempt to belong.
So your brain does what brains do with threat signals. It builds an avoidance system around it. And avoidance systems are efficient, but they're not smart. They don't distinguish between "this specific trend might genuinely not be for me" and "anything popular is automatically suspicious." They just pattern match to the surface feature, popularity, and trigger the same protective response every time. This becomes a psychological loop with its own internal logic. Different feels safe, same feels exposed, avoid sameness, feel separate, interpret separateness as identity, reinforce the avoidance. Over time, this doesn't just shape your taste in music or clothes, it shapes your willingness to be vulnerable, because vulnerability requires letting someone see you do something ordinary, something unguarded, something that isn't curated for distinctiveness. The long-term impact is subtle but real. You can end up so committed to not being like everyone else that you lose access to simple, shared human experiences, the ease of liking something just because it feels good, without needing it to also say something about who you are. Joy gets filtered through identity management before it's allowed to just be joy. But here's the possibility hiding inside all of this. The mechanism that built this pattern can also unbuild it. A nervous system that learned sameness equals danger can also learn, slowly, that sameness is sometimes just sameness, neutral, unthreatening, occasionally even comforting. That's not a personality change, it's a recalibration. The shift starts with a new perspective, and it's a small one. Popularity is not a referendum on authenticity. Something can be loved by millions and still be true for you. Something can be obscure and still be wrong for you. The number of people who like a thing tells you almost nothing about whether you genuinely like it too, and treating popularity as automatic evidence against something is just as reactive as treating it as automatic evidence for something. From there, the new response is simple to describe and hard to practice. Before reacting to something, pause long enough to ask what you actually feel about it, independent of who else is into it. Not, is this cool because it's rare, or is this tainted because it's common, but does this genuinely interest me? That pause is where the old reflex loses its grip, because it forces evaluation to happen before identity protection kicks in. New boundaries follow naturally. You get to keep your independence. That part was never the problem, but you stop requiring it to prove itself by being in constant opposition to whatever's popular. You can let a friendship include someone who likes mainstream things without it treating it as a referendum on their depth. You can enjoy something everyone else is enjoying at the same time they are, without it costing you your sense of being your own person. The transformation isn't becoming someone who follows trends. It's becoming someone whose nonconformity is actually chosen in real time, rather than running automatically in the background like a default setting you never agreed to. That's the real difference between someone who is independent and someone who is just allergic to the crowd. One is a stance, the other is a wound wearing the costume of a stance. What you're left with when the loop finally loosens isn't a different personality, it's the same person but lighter, because so much of the energy that used to go into calculating distance from everyone else is suddenly free to go somewhere else, toward the things you actually want, toward people, regardless of what they happen to like, toward joy that doesn't need a justification. Think of it less like abandoning a fortress and more like finally opening a window in a house you built to keep something out a long time ago. The walls can stay, you just don't have to live in the dark to prove they're working. You were never wrong to protect yourself, you just don't have to keep fighting a battle that already ended. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever caught yourself pulling away from something the second it got popular, or testing people based on what they like instead of who they are, sit with that for a second instead of brushing past it. Where do you think that pattern started for you? Drop it in the comments. Not the trend you're avoiding, the moment, if you remember it, when standing apart first started to feel safer than fitting in. This channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, so if this resonated, stay close. There's more of this coming, and I'd rather figure it out with you than talk at you.